I once booked an Airbnb in Arizona for a job interview. It wasn't exactly a luxury vacation, just a quick 3-day trip to get the interview out of the way and maybe explore a little. The Airbnb was cheap, way cheaper than any hotel I could find, and only about half an hour from the interview location. It was tucked away at the end of some dead-end, secluded road with a decent view of the desert in the backyard. Peaceful, quiet, or so I thought. I brought my laptop with me to keep up with work during the day. Most of my time was spent either preparing for the interview or on my laptop. The place itself was small but cozy enough. A little living room, a kitchen, a bedroom, and that quiet desert view. My interview was scheduled for Tuesday, so I planned to leave Friday. Monday night rolled around, and I was sitting in the living room, brushing up on potential interview questions, taking notes on the company, and just generally over-preparing. It was probably around 9 p.m. when I heard it. A tap at the window. Now, it wasn't a knock. It was softer, lighter, like someone tapping a finger or maybe even a stick. My head snapped toward the window, but all I saw was darkness. Pitch black. For a second, I debated just ignoring it. It was probably nothing, right? But the paranoia got to me. I stood up, walked over, and peered out the window. Nothing. Just the empty backyard stretching into the dark desert. Maybe it was a bug. Arizona has some freakishly big bugs. After all, I shook it off and got back to my prep. The interview the next day went well, or at least I thought it did. I rewarded myself with a little sightseeing in my car, trying out a few local restaurants, and spending some time in the backyard, soaking up the sun. It felt good to relax. What I didn't know at the time was that someone may have been watching me. That night, while I was inside binge-watching Breaking Bad on Netflix, I heard it again. The same tap. The same window. This time, though, it wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. My stomach dropped. I paused the show, stood up, and rushed to the window. Just like before, there was no one there. But I wasn't taking any chances. I checked all the windows near the front door, opened it, and scanned the area. Still nothing. Determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I went to the back door and stepped outside onto the porch. The desert air was cold, and the silence out there was almost oppressive. And then I heard it, a click. The sound of someone clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth. It came from somewhere in the dark, just outside the glow of the porch light. My heart started racing. I scanned the area, feeling like someone could jump out from behind any one of the bushes. Then, like they were taunting me, I heard another click. I squinted into the darkness, and that's when I saw them. A figure, dressed in dark clothes, blending into the shadows. They weren't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, just standing there, watching. My first instinct was to yell, so I did. "You're on private property. I'm calling the cops if you don't leave." The figure didn't move for a moment, and then, suddenly, they walked off, fast. Too fast. It wasn't a casual stroll. It was an eerily quick pace, almost like they were gliding. I stood there for a moment, shaken. Was it the Airbnb host? It was a crazy thought, but who else would be out there? Still, I had no proof, so I went back inside, locked every door and window, and tried to shake it off. The following night, I was back in bed, watching more Breaking Bad on my laptop. The encounter from the night before lingered in my mind, but the house was quiet, and I started to relax. I eventually turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and shut my eyes. 10 seconds later, I heard it. A click. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the closet. I froze, staring at the closet door, which was open just a crack. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my car keys, and ran straight to my car, still in my pajamas. I locked the doors, started the engine, and called 911. As I sat there in the driveway, staring at the dark house, I half expected to see someone walk out, but no one did. When the police arrived, they searched the house with me. It wasn't a big place, and there weren't many places for someone to hide. The closet was empty, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet, somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. I packed up my things that night and checked into a nearby hotel. Later, I contacted Airbnb and the host. I managed to get a partial refund, but the whole experience still haunts me. The lack of forced entry made me think that whoever it was might have had a key. Was it the host? A previous guest? Or maybe some stranger who managed to sneak in at just the right time? I'll never know for sure. What do you think? Could it have been the host? Or was it just a random intruder who somehow got in? And what would you have done if you were in my shoes? My wife Cheryl and I had been together for 10 years, married for 2, and we'd just taken the plunge into buying our first house together. It wasn't just any house, it was our dream home. A charming place tucked away on a quiet street in a small inland Georgia town. I'm keeping the town's name vague because, well, you'll understand why soon enough. We fell in love with the property at first sight. It had everything we wanted. A big yard that backed up to a dense patch of woods, perfect for the dog we planned to adopt and the kids we hoped to raise someday. It felt like the kind of place where we could finally settle down, build a life, and enjoy the tranquility of small-town living. That tranquility didn't last long. The first 2 nights in the house were blissfully uneventful. It was the weekend, so Cheryl and I spent our days unpacking and setting up our new space. By Monday night, though, things took a turn I'll never forget. We were in bed, lights out, just starting to drift off when it happened. A sound? Faint at first, but unmistakable. Music. Old, crackly, vintage music. The kind you'd expect to hear on a record player in some forgotten era. Cheryl and I locked eyes, the confusion and fear mirrored on both our faces. This wasn't music from one of our neighbors. It was coming from our backyard. I got up, heart racing, and opened the window to get a better listen. The song was clearer now, and it sent chills down my spine. Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? By Henry Hall. It should have been a cheerful tune, but in that moment, it sounded anything but. It was eerie, menacing even. I ran downstairs, convinced it had to be some prank, and found the switch to the backyard lights. I flipped them on and stepped outside, bracing myself for, I don't know what, but there was no one there. The music wasn't coming from the yard. It was coming from the woods. I stood there in the cool night air, staring into the blackness, the song echoing through the trees. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I went back upstairs and told Cheryl it was probably just some dumb kids messing with us, the new people in town. Saying it out loud, though, even I didn't believe it. Who would go through that kind of effort? And why? We tried to laugh it off. But the next night, the music came back. This time louder. This time, the song was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. You know the one. Cheryl and I froze. This wasn't random. Someone was doing this on purpose. I looked out the window, and that's when I saw it. Not a person, but something on the grass, a small object. I told Cheryl I was going to check it out. She begged me to just call the cops, but I couldn't. I needed to prove to myself, and to whoever was out there, that I wasn't afraid. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the yard. The object was an old, dusty radio. The music was blaring from it, its staticky sound cutting through the quiet night. I turned it off and held it up to show Cheryl through the window. Someone left this here to scare us, I shouted. That's when Cheryl started screaming. Run, she yelled, her voice breaking. Run, they're behind you. I froze. My blood ran cold as I turned toward the woods. There they were, 3 figures, standing perfectly still, spaced out like they were posing for a nightmare. They weren't running at me. They weren't moving at all. They were just watching. I bolted back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Cheryl was upstairs, sobbing, and I could barely speak as I called the cops. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The police arrived quickly, thank God, and we told them everything. I showed them the radio and begged them to take it as evidence. I thought maybe they could pull fingerprints or something. They agreed and even checked the edge of the woods with their flashlights. They didn't find anyone, but I hoped their presence would scare off whoever was out there. The cops left, but the feeling of safety didn't come back with them. Cheryl and I barely slept that night, and every little sound made us jump. We haven't heard the music since, and we haven't seen those figures again, but the memory of that night has stayed with us. This all happened just a few weeks ago. We still live in the house, but every evening when the sun sets, I feel that same unease creeping in. I've even thought about setting up cameras, just in case. God forbid they come back. I'll be ready to get it on video if they do. But I can't help but wonder, who were those people? Why were they doing this? And was it really just some cruel prank? Or something worse? What would you do if it were you? Would you stay and fight for your home? Or would you leave? And most importantly, who or what do you think was behind those figures in the woods? I've been a nurse for several years now, and in that time, I've worked in various hospitals and care facilities. I've seen my fair share of strange and emotional experiences, but nothing could prepare me for what happened at my previous job. For a short, unforgettable period, I worked the night shift at a geriatric hospital about 30 minutes from my house. It was the kind of place where patients were often fragile and forgetful, and caring for them required more emotional labor than physical. I had dealt with older patients before, so I thought I knew what to expect. I was wrong. It happened during my second-to-last shift at that hospital, a shift I wish I could erase from memory. That night, I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward, a place where time seemed to move differently. Most of the patients there were incredibly sweet, and they seemed to enjoy my presence. Being a young woman in my 20s, I think I reminded them of their grandchildren, or maybe just brought them a sense of comfort in their otherwise hazy realities. But one patient that night stood out from the rest. Her name was Lena. It was my first time looking after her, and Lena was far more restless than the other patients. Every time I entered her room, she would clutch my hand, her voice trembling as she told me about the voices she could hear and the man in black she claimed to see standing in the corner of her room. Her descriptions were vivid, too vivid for my liking, and they left me uneasy, but I chalked it up to her condition and did my best to comfort her. Lena wasn't alone in the room. Her roommate had requested that the curtain dividing the space remain closed, likely to keep Lena from disturbing her too much. This roommate, a quiet and forgetful woman, would smile whenever I walked in but rarely said a word. I couldn't blame her for wanting her privacy. Lena's fears were intense. By 11 p.m., most of the patients had fallen asleep. Everyone except Lena, that is. She kept calling for me, her face pale and her hands trembling as she insisted that the voices were getting louder and the man in black was moving closer. Her fear was contagious. Though I tried to remind myself that what she was experiencing wasn't real, the way she described it made my skin crawl. I held her hands and whispered reassurances. "It's okay, Lena. Just breathe. You're safe here. I'm right outside if you need me." She eventually calmed down, and by the time I returned to her room an hour later, she was finally asleep. The hours between midnight and dawn on a night shift can be painfully slow. Once the patients were asleep, the silence of the ward became almost oppressive. Time felt like it was moving backward. To keep busy, I went to the linen room to restock my cart with supplies. The linen room was small and eerily quiet, with no windows and a single door that I had shut behind me. As I worked, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, like a whisper. I froze and looked around, but there was nothing. Shrugging it off, I continued restocking my cart, but then I felt it. A hand, something large and firm, grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The room was empty. My breath hitched as I stared at the spot where I'd felt the touch. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped into the hallway to see if anyone else was around, but the corridor was empty. The whole ward was deathly silent. I returned to the linen room, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I resumed my task, stacking towels and sheets onto the cart, when I glanced toward the door. And that's when I saw him. A man dressed in black was standing on the other side of the glass door, staring at me with a wide, unsettling grin. His face was pale, almost inhuman, and his eyes seemed to pierce right through me. I screamed. I screamed so loudly that my voice echoed through the ward, waking several of the patients. The man didn't move. He just stood there, smiling, as if he was enjoying my terror. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, the hallway was empty. Seconds later, one of the other nurses burst into the room, her face full of concern. "Are you okay? What happened?" "There was a man," I stammered. "He was standing right there, looking at me." She glanced at the door, then back at me. "There's no one here." Together, we checked every room in the ward, but there was no sign of the man in black. My hands were still shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. I went to check on Lena, who had been woken by the commotion. She was sitting upright in her bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. When I entered the room, she clutched my arm and whispered, "The voices, they said he's coming. The man in black. He's here." I stared at her, my blood running cold. "What does he look like, Lena?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time all night, her expression sharpened. "How do you know what he looks like?" she asked, her voice trembling. My heart skipped a beat. Before I could respond, Lena started screaming, "Get me out of here. He's coming." Her screams were shrill and desperate, and the other nurses rushed in to calm her down. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I asked to be reassigned to another ward for the rest of the night. I left early, unable to shake the image of the man in black from my mind. The next day, I texted the head nurse and informed her that my next shift would be my last. I couldn't stay in that building, not after what I had experienced. I've never been diagnosed with any mental health conditions, nor have I ever had hallucinations before. I know what sleep deprivation can do to a person, but this was something else. The feeling of that hand on my shoulder, the man's face in the glass, and Lena's vivid descriptions. It was too much to dismiss as coincidence. Was it all just my imagination? Or was it something else, something I can't explain? I may never know, but I hope I never experience anything like it again. Was the man in black a product of sleep deprivation, or was he something supernatural? Could Lena's descriptions have influenced the nurse's mind, or was there a deeper connection between Lena and this mysterious figure? What would you have done in her shoes? It was a quiet, uneventful night when I was driving home from work, taking my usual route. It was just past midnight, probably around 12:15 a.m., and the streets of my small town were as lifeless as they usually are at that hour. My town is mostly woods and farmlands, with only the occasional cluster of houses breaking up the endless stretches of trees and open fields. That night, the air was warm, about 75 degrees, and the skies were clear. I had the top down on my convertible, enjoying the breeze as I cruised along at 50 miles per hour. I was on a long, empty stretch of road bordered by a cornfield on one side and a dense patch of woods on the other when I heard it. A piercing, blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness of the night. It was a woman's scream, raw and desperate, but I couldn't pinpoint which side of the road it had come from. My heart skipped a beat as I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching on the pavement. The car skidded to a halt, and I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, I heard it again, a woman crying out for help. This time, it was clear the sound was coming from the woods to my left. I grabbed the baton I kept in the back seat and got out of the car, the cool night air brushing against my skin. Standing there on the side of the road, I yelled out, "Who's out there? Are you okay?" The voice immediately responded, trembling with desperation, "Please help me." Without thinking twice, I ran into the woods, my heart racing and my mind blank except for the primal urge to help. I called out, "Keep yelling so I can find you." And every 10 seconds or so, I'd hear her scream again, each time a shaky, pleading, "Help." I sprinted toward the sound, pushing through the brush and swiping away branches that clawed at my arms and face. But no matter how fast or how far I ran, her screams never seemed to get any closer. They were always the same distance away, like some cruel trick of the forest. It was then that a chilling thought struck me. Something didn't feel right. I stopped dead in my tracks, panting and glancing around the darkness that surrounded me. My instincts, which had been drowned out by adrenaline until that moment, finally screamed louder than the woman's cries. This wasn't normal. My gut told me I wasn't chasing someone who needed help. I was walking straight into something I didn't understand, and it wasn't good. I called out one last time, "Where are you? Tell me where you are." But instead of giving me an answer, the woman just screamed, "Help," again, her voice carrying the same eerie, consistent tone and distance. My stomach twisted. I didn't like this. My brain was yelling at me to get out of there. I turned and bolted, sprinting back the way I'd come. The underbrush cracked beneath my feet as I ran, and the only light guiding me was the faint, flickering glow of my car's hazard lights still flashing in the distance. But as I ran, The woman's cries didn't fade into the background. They stayed the same, just as distant as before, as if she were following me. Or worse, as if she was everywhere. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my car, I didn't stop running until I was inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I threw the baton onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out of there without looking back. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the wheel straight. My heart didn't stop pounding until I was halfway home. When I finally felt safe enough to breathe, I called 911 and reported what had happened. I told them about the screams, the location, and everything else I could remember. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out, but I wasn't about to hang around to find out what they'd find. That night, I barely slept. The next day, I told a few close friends and family about what had happened. They all had the same reaction, a mix of shock and unease, with one or two suggesting that I'd done the right thing by calling the authorities but was crazy to have gone into the woods in the first place. I was ready to chalk it up to a strange and creepy one-off experience, something I'd probably never get a real explanation for. I just wanted to move on. But then, a week later, I turned on the local news and saw a report that made my stomach drop. The body of a woman in her 30s had been discovered in the woods by a man hiking with his dog. The cause of death was unclear, but there were no immediate signs of foul play. My blood ran cold when the location of the body was announced. It was the same patch of woods where I'd heard the screams. The report didn't reveal much more than that. The investigation was ongoing, and the authorities were waiting for an autopsy to determine the cause of death. But as I sat there, staring at the TV, I couldn't shake the horrible feeling that I might have been connected to her somehow. Was she alive and screaming for help when I'd been in the woods that night? Or was there something else out there, luring me deeper into the trees? Even now, I can't make sense of what happened. Was it just a bizarre coincidence? Or did I hear her ghost calling out to me, desperate to be found? Or worse, was something sinister out there, using her voice to lure people in? I'll never know for sure, but I haven't taken that route home since. If you were in the storyteller's shoes, would you have gone into the woods to investigate the screams? Or do you think it was something supernatural trying to lure them in? What's your take on the connection between the screams and the discovery of the woman's body? Before Jenny and I officially started dating, we often hung out together. We both loved snowboarding, so when she invited me to her family's cabin in Vermont for a weekend getaway, I eagerly said yes. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, not far from Stowe Mountain Resort, a cozy retreat she promised would offer a weekend of adventure and relaxation. It sounded perfect. The drive up there was an experience in itself. The last stretch of the journey was a winding, secluded road surrounded by towering pines and snow-covered fields. The further we drove, the fewer houses we saw. Most of the driveways we passed were untouched, the snow pristine, which Jenny explained was because many of the houses were owned by out-of-staters who only visited during the peak season. As we neared her family's property, she shouted, "Slow down! It's coming up." If she hadn't, I would have missed the barely visible turnoff, a narrow, snow-laden trail leading to her cabin. When we pulled up, the house was just as she had described, small, rustic, and covered in a thick blanket of snow. It radiated charm and coziness, but the isolation was almost overwhelming. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. We spent the evening settling in, cooking dinner, and watching the pursuit of happiness before falling asleep on the couch. The cabin had everything we needed: electricity, heat, but no running water. There was an outhouse a short walk from the main house for, well, obvious reasons. That night, I avoided the trek to the outhouse by stepping onto the front deck and peeing into the snow. The stillness of the night was both serene and unsettling, with only the sound of soft snowflakes hitting the ground. The next morning, we woke early to the blaring alarms on our phones. Excited to hit the slopes, we ate breakfast and began gearing up. Before we left, I made a quick trip to the outhouse. As I trudged through the snow, I noticed a trail of footprints. They were large and looked human, but I couldn't be sure. The trail wrapped around the house and disappeared into the woods. When I called Jenny out to look, she dismissed it, saying it was probably a black bear. "They're everywhere up here," she reassured me. We spent the day at the resort, snowboarding from dawn until dusk. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was pitch black and snowing again. We cranked up the heat, lit a fire, and blasted some music while we sipped on beers. It felt like the perfect end to a perfect day. But as the night wore on, things took a turn. Around midnight, I had to pee again, so I reluctantly ventured out to the outhouse in the freezing cold. This time, I decided to close the outhouse door behind me to keep the wind and snow out. As I sat there, the muffled sound of music playing inside the cabin was suddenly interrupted by something outside. A crunching noise in the snow. Footsteps. My first thought was Jenny, but when I called her name, there was no response. The footsteps didn't stop, and my stomach dropped. I texted her, "Are you outside?" The message didn't go through right away, thanks to the terrible reception up there. I stayed still, straining to listen. Then, the music from the house abruptly cut off. My blood ran cold as I realized the lights were out, too. I finished as quickly as I could and stepped out into the darkness, my phone's flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The fresh tracks in the snow led back toward the house, but something about them felt off. They stopped at the front door, but then continued around the cabin. I reached the door and pounded on it, calling Jenny's name. Suddenly, the door flew open, and I felt an arm yank me inside. It was Jenny. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her face pale and terrified. In a shaky whisper, she told me that a man had tried to open the door while I was outside. She'd locked it as soon as I left, scared to be alone. When the stranger realized the door wouldn't budge, he walked around the house, peering into the windows. Jenny said she'd seen him through the living room window, his shadowy figure moving slowly, deliberately, as if looking for a way inside. My heart pounded as I processed what she was saying. We needed to protect ourselves. She mentioned a hidden cellar in the floor where her dad kept a few rifles. Using my phone's flashlight, I found the hatch and climbed down to grab one of the guns. We turned off all the lights and sat on the couch in silence, waiting. The only sound was the relentless snowfall outside, until the footsteps returned. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow just outside the cabin. My grip on the gun tightened as I stood and made my way to the door. Without hesitation, I flung it open and fired 3 shots into the air, screaming at the top of my lungs. The footsteps stopped. I hoped the echoing gunshots were enough to scare the intruder away. We didn't sleep that night. When morning finally came, we packed up and left under Jenny's father's advice. He assured us there was nothing in the house worth stealing, but it was best to be cautious. We drove away, leaving the cabin and its eerie silence behind us. That night was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It wasn't just the isolation or the snowstorm. It was the terrifying realization that someone had been watching us, waiting for an opportunity. Who was that man? What did he want? And why was he there? Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he might have been someone familiar with the area, maybe someone who knew how remote and vulnerable we were. It's an experience Jenny and I will never forget, and it left us wondering. How many times do we brush past danger without even knowing it? What do you think happened that night? Was it just a random intruder? Or was there something more sinister at play? And would you have stayed in the cabin or left the moment the lights went out?